Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us. This is an opportunity to have a conversation about everything from the NAEP scores, the National Report Card scores, to some of your priorities. And actually, I was in the gym today and got a question from a council person who said, ask her about Common Core. Where is that at right now? So I know there's a lot of interest in what's happening in education in Tennessee, and you've been on the job for a little less than a year.
That's right. January 19th, 20th may have been my first day. I was sworn in on the 17th, and we had a holiday that Monday, so it's almost a year now.
Excellent.
Hard to believe.
Tell us a little bit about the tour, because you embarked on a very ambitious tour of all 95 counties of Tennessee. How's that going?
Yeah, so let me start there, and then I would love to talk a bit more about the strategic plan and TNReady and address some of the standards questions that you got. I get those in the gym too, so sometimes you don't want to go to the gym because you get questions. Well, I would first say that we embarked very early on, maybe February, on something called the Classroom Chronicles Tour. And the idea for me was to get into teachers' classrooms and to see what the reforms that had been really done over the last several years, what it looked like on the ground, what was happening in classrooms, what were teachers saying, and what type of teaching and learning was going on, what does the student engagement look like on the ground. And so we had a goal of reaching 10,000 teachers, being inside classrooms, conducting teacher roundtables to get their voice heard in different areas across the state, and certainly to engage with superintendents and board members as well as legislators when we would go into their area to get a feel for the communities. And we're at a little over 8,000 teachers now, and that has been a mix of variety of roundtables. We've got 30 plus roundtables, plus being in so many classrooms at this point. And usually when I go to a school, we're in somewhere around 8 classrooms in an hour. Mm-hmm. Now, that means we're actually there looking at what's happening, and we're giving feedback to the teachers. When we come back, we give feedback to them about what we've seen. We usually take a picture while we're there. And so there's a relationship building as well to say we value the work that you're doing and we appreciate what you're doing as well. The teacher roundtables have looked fairly similar. We typically are asking questions about what are the successes, what are the challenges you're experiencing, and then that last question is, do you feel valued, and why or why not? And then they also share who they feel valued by or who they don't feel valued by, and that can range anything from valued by their district administration, school administration, or not feeling valued by parents, or not feeling valued by the state, or whatever their response is. We take that very seriously because we want to encourage more people to go into the teaching profession. And so the entire tour has been really twofold. One, I'm not sure I completely had a big picture view until I started the tour around the incredible work that's going on in all parts of the state. I think you believe that, you hear about certain districts and the work that's happening there. We've not been to one district where I left and thought, okay, that's a tragedy. That's not happened. It's, you leave and you are inspired by what's happening on the ground with real kids every day, and that the communities that have wrapped around higher standards, more rigorous expectations, around how they want all of their kids to go to post-secondary. That is everywhere. Whether you're in a very small rural county who have a district with 300 kids, or whether you're in Shelby County with a huge district. You see that value that's being placed on education in the community, and they're all trying to align to drive to 55. They're trying to align to the Tennessee Promise opportunity. The second thing that I've learned that's been the biggest takeaway is that we've got to do our work by supporting teachers, celebrating the work teachers are doing, making sure that 70,000 educators that we have in our state actually are invested in our work. So we have to listen more, hear what they're saying to us, and then use what they believe is important, what they tell us about what great instruction learning looks like on the ground, and then use that for our decision making on a more regular basis. I knew that for someone who's trained teachers for the last 13 years, but even more so in this role, how much we need to listen, how much we need to engage our teachers in advising us, because our theory of action is we can't get to 1 million public school kids in Tennessee unless we engage 70,000 teachers across the state and really work through those teachers to impact the lives of students. It's a great tour so far.
Oh, good. You mentioned that question about do you feel valued. What's the general sense that you're getting, and what are the things that you're learning from that question?
Sure, there's been varied response to that depending on where I am. And so there have been variances in people's responses. Some areas you go to and you sense this extraordinary camaraderie and collaborative feel on how they're working together as a team in their school or in their district. Some places you leave and you think something's not right. They don't have a collaborative feel. They're not working together on a regular basis where they feel a value being placed on them by their peers or by their administration. And some of them said, I don't feel valued by the state. I mean, we've certainly heard that. That's not pervasive, but you hear that in pockets. And typically when you might hear something like that, or I'm not feeling valued by my district administration or my school administration, what they're referencing is, typically when you dig into it, is I don't have the resources to do what I'm being asked to do. So it's not, I don't think you care about me. It's more, I need additional materials, or I want to align to higher expectations, but I need these types of resources to do that. I see what works when I have it, and I need that type of support to do the work that I'm being asked to do. And so it's usually a very valid comment about the resources and support that they need.
So let's talk a little bit about TNReady and standards.
Yes.
And where we are with that, because I know that there's been a lot of confusion in terms of what's teaching. Well, I'm certainly confused, so I should speak just for myself. That you could, Jason has helped illuminate me quite a bit in terms of what's going on, but I'd love to hear from you in terms of where are we and how are we preparing essentially for this new test?
Absolutely. And I would start a bit historically, because I think it's important to realize where we are now. This story didn't start with me. It's been a story in Tennessee that's happened over time. Back in 2007 in Tennessee, we got an F in Truth in Advertising from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for how we were sharing proficiency levels with students in Tennessee and where they were comparatively on a national assessment on NAEP. And so where we would say in Tennessee we have 70% of our kids proficient, they would take the NAEP assessment and 24% of them would be proficient. So there was this gap of what you were saying was proficient and the reality of what proficiency meant. That set in place a series of events. 2008, we changed to higher standards. They were called the Tennessee Diploma Project Standards, which were based on the America Diploma Project Standards, was where a group of states were really working toward this move toward post-secondary readiness. After those standards came into place, lots of alignment to higher expectations. We changed, how the rigor of our TCAP test, even though we were still using multiple choice questions, the rigor of those questions changed because of the content. And then in 2010, we transitioned to the Common Core standards in both math and ELA. And then 2 years ago, we adopted the social studies standards, which are our higher, more rigorous standards. So there has been this incremental change, which I would say has been a pathway to the progress that we've made over the last several years. We've started early. We said we're going to take this seriously. It's a call to action. And now we're going to adjust our expectations. During that same time period, we've been getting ready for a new assessment that aligns to the full breadth of what the standards actually say. So if you take a multiple choice test, you are only getting at a certain level of what the standard may be asking about, right? You have to create a test question that's aligned to the standard, but ultimately multiple choice question might not get at what that standard is actually intending for you to know. And so we are in a transition phase where we now can say with TNReady, we're aligning to the full breadth of what the standard has intended. Not just what a multiple question would get you, multiple choice question, but what a multi-step problem might get you, or what a writing response would help you understand about that student's ability to master that standard. And so the standards alignment to the assessment now matches, because we can say we've got questions that go from top to bottom, knowledge to analysis to synthesis, when you think about what that standard really intends. What that looks like in TNReady is a test that's now in two parts. Now let me tell you how we've been getting ready for that. This is not really new. The way we're talking about it feels new, but we've had a writing assessment in Tennessee that was almost like part one, that was happening in the same window we're giving part one for the last few years. So part one is given in February for the majority of students across Tennessee. It's given during the same time frame that we were giving the writing assessment. And the writing assessment had moved fully online this past year. So we'd had an opportunity to do a February test, fully online, primarily writing. We've been preparing for this. We also have been preparing in math over the last few years to do the types of responses on questions that we're going to have this year through something called CRAs. These CRAs were given in Tennessee for several years. Again, this was an open-ended math response that was intended to move us toward what this new assessment would ultimately look like this year. So we've had these moments. Constructed response assessment, so it's essentially essay, more open-ended type response. And then we moved to fully online with our social studies field test last year, which again was a no stakes test. And so we've been moving to online for the last couple of years as well. So now we're at a moment where we have part one, which is not called the writing assessment. It's a more constructed response, multi-step problem assessment that's in math and ELA. And that is now what took the place of writing assessment. Part two still has a variety of types of questions, but that's where you're going to see more of the multiple choice questions that are more similar to what we've been doing. And that part two is given during the typical TCAP window, which would be the April 1st of May timeframe. And so these two parts really get at what we've been doing as a state. Now we're putting it into one test, one cohesive unit. We will get one score. You put both of those parts together, and a student will get one score like they typically have on the TCAP in the past. So what are the big changes? The big changes are, one, you are now going to have a test that answers questions that, again, think about the multiple levels of what the standard intended. The questions would be more open response, more multiple step problems in math in particular, more reading. Reading that actually requires their writing to be based on the text that they read, and they would have to quote evidence and take evidence out of what they read to answer the writing prompt. In some cases, depending on the grade level, you would be reading multiple text and then answering a question about how do you synthesize what the two texts said to answer some kind of a prompt. And the prompt is less, what do you think about Bobby? And more, tell me how was Bobby similar or different in the two descriptions of Bobby. That's a low-level question. But there would be primary documents, for example. And you would read these two primary documents in social studies, and then you would have a prompt to compare and contrast what you read, or a specific statement that you would have to respond to with evidence based, again, on what you can pull out of the two texts. Which, by the way, is what we really do in real life. That's what you do in post-secondary, it's what you do in a job. You're typically reading informational text, nonfiction text, and you're trying to make sense of that for college or for the workplace. And so this has more authenticity around what the expectation would be when they move out of high school. The whole point of TNReady that we've really tried to talk a lot about over the last probably 6 to 8 months is that this conversation is not about just changing a test. And we don't want that to be the message. The message is, why in the world would we change the test? Why is this important to Tennessee? It's important because you align to what the expectations are. And we have standards that have set expectations, but the way those standards are then assessed also set expectations. I'll give you an example. 13 years I've trained teachers. And I don't remember any class I ever taught where I would have someone who'd been out in the field, student teaching, or whether they'd been in a clinical experience, and they would come back and they would say, well, I see the teacher teaching this way, but the test is only going to be about this, right? It's going to be multiple choice. They're trying to get the kids to write, but the way the kids are going to be assessed have nothing to do with that. And there's a frustration, there's a gap that I am trying to teach here, but ultimately you're going to tell me how well I did by breaking this down into a multiple choice test. And so what this is intended to do is say, we want you to teach what that standard intends, and we want you to be assessed based on that teaching and what that standard intends, not have that misalignment that over time has been there. Big change, because this is the first time we have had this type of test transition, changing the full structure of the test since 1983. And then we are moving to completely online, which again is a change. So we're expecting this to be a transition period. We're expecting there to be challenges. We're expecting that we're going to have to move through this with you know, we're together in this. We're not trying to beat you with a stick and say you better perform like you should on this first year. This is a transition, because now we are moving to an assessment that matches the intent of where we've been with standards. The second reason this is important, again to the why, is that we have around 64% of our students entering college having to take remedial or developmental courses. That means they leave high school with the expectation that they're ready for the next step. And that's not happening, because when they're going into post-secondary, they're being told you can't take credit-bearing coursework yet. You're going to have to take some courses that are more similar to what they would have had in high school, and they're having to pay for it, right? It's not credit-bearing, they're paying for it. It was the most depressing moments I had in my former job in higher education, when I would sit across from a freshman who, bright-eyed, she wanted to be a teacher, and I would have to tell her, well, you're actually going to have to take 2 remedial math courses. You're going to pay for them, but they don't count for credit. So even though you're taking 5 classes, you know, only 3 of them are counting for credit. I've shared this with several groups. I did that for years, and one time a student said to me, well, I wish you'd go back and tell my high school that. And I've laughed about that, because I said, now I can go back and tell the high school that this isn't working. We don't have the students prepared. And that's based on, you know, very low ACT, or low GPA, or not having the math skills, you know, based on her grades in math courses, to actually do what she wanted to do, which was to teach. You know, I want to be a teacher, and these are things that she would need to be able to do to go into you know, the teaching profession or any field. And so we're trying to say you've got to raise the baseline in K-12, so you can remove that gap that happens when you walk across the stage, get the diploma, try to go to the next stage. Well, we've got this gap that's here. So now we've got to raise the baseline so the gaps start shrinking, and we don't have those students going into post-secondary not prepared. So this is about alignment. It's about alignment to what the needs are when they leave.
Since the testing will all be online, there were concerns initially that some of the districts may not have the equipment, or the students wouldn't be prepared in their skill level to be able to take the tests online. Mm-hmm. Has that all been resolved, or are there still going to be pockets that need to be addressed?
Well, we've been very, very proud of how the districts over the last 2 to 2.5 years have stepped up in multiple ways. One, the state put an investment in technology that really helped boost this initial technology infrastructure work that needed to happen, you know, increasing bandwidth, having more devices available to kids. And so we've seen that boost, but then the local areas have also made investments in making sure they have more devices for kids. And so in partnership, we now have an incredible moment in time where we have no district that has requested paper and pencil test. We did a readiness analysis and have shared that. I know with Jason several months ago, but we share that back with the districts as well. Here's what we need in terms of bandwidth. This is our suggestion for how many devices you should have for the number of students per school. And based on that analysis, we had a huge majority ready to go, and those who said, well, we're not ready right now, they're getting ready. They're adding more devices, they're doing the things necessary. So we've had no one ask for a waiver, because everyone wants to move toward the online environment. We do have paper and pencil backup, but folks have said this is important, and it's not important just because of the test. When you talk to superintendents and principals, they get it. So this is about, this is an equity issue. Like, kids need to be on devices, on technology, using computers in the normal teaching and learning cycle. So when they go out into the workplace, they're not at a disadvantage because they don't have the skills necessary. And that's the message that's the more important message. That's sort of the real story. The real message that we're sending is that the assessment may have moved people in that right direction, but ultimately this was the right thing to do, to move more of our kids to have technology in their hand. Now, we do sometimes get I'm worried about my third graders' keyboarding skills, right? You know, is that going to be a detriment to their ability to show their true content knowledge when they get in an online environment? We have said we understand that concern. I mean, I've talked to third grade teachers. Our teacher of the year this year is a third grade teacher, and she spoke to this in a parent teletown hall we did last night on the topic. And I would echo what she has said. She has said, you know, kids now are natives to technology, right? They start using it, they pick up on the tools very quickly, drag and drop, you know, you do it 2 or 3 times, they've already taken to it, where we may have more of a problem actually transitioning to the technology. After they learn the tools and they do keyboarding, you know, typically schools are having kids do keyboarding as early as 3rd grade, that they transition to this very easily. So we believe that we will have a transition period to make sure kids have the keyboarding skills, but that's not the reason not to do it. We have to keep moving that forward and support our teachers. And certainly, I know you in this room know this, the General Assembly passed back in the spring this transition period where we don't have a stick again for teachers while we're in this transition period. We've lessened the amount of TNReady in terms of the whole teacher evaluation model over the next 2 years. So that 35% growth measure has been lessened for year 1 and year 2, so that we have a transition period for both teachers and students. Because we believe we've got to keep moving forward, even though we're going to have these moments where, okay, are we 100% ready? We absolutely will be ready over a transition period of 1 to 3 years.
The expectations that you've talked about, this is in terms of looking at the coverage, this is above
Right.
and beyond Common Core. How would you describe it as separate or different from Common Core?
No, that's a great question. So we've moved to higher standards in 3 areas since 2010. So math, English language arts, and social studies. And so primarily when you see these new types of questions, this variety of question types, you're talking about where we've already changed standards. Again, math, English language arts, and social studies, because they're the more rigorous standards that have this breadth of the writing and the increased reading. And certainly the multiple step problems. So where we've moved to higher standards, that's where the assessment will match. Science will look the same because we're in a science review process right now. Draft science standards out there on the web right now for teachers to give feedback on. As we transition to new science standards, then we will align those science standards to the new test questions and test types.
Education is often politicized, as we're all aware here, and one of the interesting things during your tenure has been the review of social studies standards. Could you talk a little bit about that? What went through that process in terms of moving up that timetable?
No, I appreciate the question. So we gave a social studies field test back in the April-May time period, so back in the spring in the normal test window. And we actually learned from the field test experience that from that feedback loop with teachers, again, no stakes test, we're getting feedback from teachers about the field test items, that there were things that from their feedback we thought, you know, we need to potentially push up the social studies standard review process because of the feedback we were getting from teachers around. I'll give you some examples. One, the number of standards at certain grade levels. There, we had some educators give feedback. It felt like maybe that needed to be transitioned. You know, some standards needed to be at a different grade level, or there were some grade levels where it felt like there was too much. And so, could we figure out how to move those around, or particularly streamline some of those standards? So we were getting that feedback back in the spring. So I'm new, I'm listening to that. So I remember talking with the state board over the summer, and our conversation was we need to move the social studies review process up because of feedback we were already getting. Then we were obviously getting feedback as soon as the fall started around the social studies standards and 7th grade Islam in particular. And so when we were getting that feedback, it was natural that we were already moving it up. Then let's go ahead and move it up slightly further than we would have. So we did move it up to January as opposed to starting it probably mid-year next year. We said let's go ahead and move it up to January. That will give people an opportunity to give feedback earlier so we can make the changes earlier. So there had been feedback, again, not just about 7th grade standards, but much earlier than that, just about the full package, and we needed to take a look at the number of standards we had at different grade levels. And again, this was listening to teachers. These are people who are teaching these standards on the ground. We better listen to them. What are they saying about the work that they're doing in the classroom that we need to take seriously? And I think, our team would say teachers give the very best feedback, and we've made changes along the way, even this year, based on the feedback that they've given.
How do you balance what you're taking in this review period from what you're hearing from teachers who are in the classroom teaching this material every day versus what you hear maybe from parents or from state lawmakers?
Specific to social studies?
Yes.
So, I know what the intent of our social studies standards are that are related to world religions. The intent of those standards have never been about proselytizing. The intent of those standards are always, how does world religion impact world history? When I taught, that's how you teach whatever social studies standards that has a world religion in it. I mean, that's not unusual. I mean, I don't know if there's been a teacher who's ever taught social studies that doesn't have a moment where you have a religion you're talking about, whatever that is, and you're thinking about how does that religion actually need to be discussed in the way the standard intends, which is, how does this impact world history? You and I both know you do have to talk about the elements of the religion, because those elements actually are what cause people to act in a certain way, and that usually is what impacted the events of world history, right? It's the elements of that religion and sometimes the belief system of that religion. But you're not teaching that in isolation, right? It's part of a big picture view of world history and how this fits together. So when I've gotten feedback, whether it's sitting in a legislator's office or from a parent or folks who email that have questions, that's my message. That's the intent. Could we have had a teacher somewhere give an assignment or teach it in a way that felt opposite of how it was intended? Absolutely. Okay, I have seen some assignments that were either posted on Facebook or somewhere out there in the field, and you think, that's probably not the best assignment to get at what that standard intended. But I could say that about second grade math, or I could say that about 10th grade economics. So there have been things highlighted.
Those isolated cases from getting to the point where they drive the discussion and they drive
Great question.
changes, because it can get to that point when the legislature gets involved where they could come down and
Sure.
force your hand,
Right.
because they're hearing it about an isolated case in their district.
That is the magic question right there. That's the important question, is how do we balance that? So we gave some guidance fairly early on. I believe Senator Gresham asked us to provide some guidance to districts on the issue sort of early fall. And I sent out guidance to educators and to our superintendents, and it was particular on, this is the intent. You need to be very sensitive to the types of assignments. There are some assignments that are probably just bad assignments, but quite frankly, that could be in any subject area. Okay, so you need to be thoughtful about it. You need to pay attention to what your parents are asking you about these assignments, and make sure that the teacher has the full picture of how to teach what the standard requires. And we gave guidance on that issue. I think part of this is about the teacher needs to know that he or she is supported in teaching those standards, and that we want to support and guide them in the intent of that standard. And if they have questions about how to do that, then we want to support them in additional training, conversation. Think about new teachers who are caught in this. It's the first time they've ever taught the standards, which is where we saw some rub. And they just don't know how to teach it. They don't know what that standard actually intended. And so there's been some good conversation about this is what this is about, and this is how you should teach it. So I would balance that with, when I'm talking to a legislator, that's what I say to them. This is not about changing the content of the standard. This is about some on-the-ground practice in isolated cases that need to be taken seriously, certainly, but it's less about teaching a religion wrong and more about maybe you don't know how to specifically teach the whole package of what that standard intends and how you connect it to world history. And so then a parent sees this portion of it, and they don't get the whole picture because they're only seeing the assignment, or they're seeing, an assessment question, and they don't see the whole picture. And so how are we communicating on issues that could be sensitive? I mean, when I taught, I'll give you a very specific example, and I shared this with some legislators. I used a book that was a Newbery Award-winning book, and in the book there were curse words. Well, I didn't just say, well, we're going to sit here and read this book, and I don't care what parents think about this. I knew that if I was going to make the decision to teach that book, there had to be a reason why I would decide to teach that book over another book that wouldn't have any curse words in it. So what was my decision? So I explained why. I sent a letter to parents. This is why I'm teaching the book. This is why it's important to me. It has some curse words in it, and this is how I'm going to handle it. I'm not crossing out the curse words in the book. But when we read the book aloud, we're not going to say the word. But the kids, when they're reading silently, they're going to see the words in it. We're just not going to say it aloud. We're going to talk about why that character says that. He was a foster child. Why does he use that terminology? And we're going to have that conversation. I never had a parent that came back and said, you know, that's a terrible decision. Because I was proactive. I said, why? How does it fit into my big picture? What do I want the end result of this to be? And so the feedback is we're partners. If I had a parent who said, I'm not comfortable with that, what would I have done? I would have worked with that parent and that student. I would have said, we're gonna work on a different book with you. And I would have made that accommodation, because that's what good teachers do. Teachers want to do what's best for the families, and they want to work in partnership. So when I talk to legislators, I'm like, these teachers are not purposefully doing something that was trying to proselytize on an issue. It's a support that we've got to give to them and not condemn them. When we have a few isolated cases where, sure, they may have given an assignment that didn't feel right, but the big picture was missed. The big picture of why the standard is in there has been missed in some ways. And what we want to do is to say the review process allows people to give feedback to those standards. And if there are places that need to be shored up, explained better, given more context, then this is the opportunity to do that.
Do you anticipate, or do you expect, not just on this issue, but other, this is the second or third time things like this have come up on different subjects, areas, and social, do you expect more of this controversy to come up? You're going to have to deal with it more often, do you think?
Related to social studies, or just generally?
Just general, with people disagreeing with what's in the curriculum or what's in a textbook and kind of really pushing the issue.
Well, I would say over time, being in education over 20 years, I think it's more out front now because of all the opportunities on social media and Facebook to quickly put up your idea and why you don't like this. And so I've seen a change just because of a social media explosion. But I would say 20 years ago, some of these same issues would come up locally or statewide. I was in Texas and issues would come up all the time. They didn't like how the textbook talked about guns, or whatever. So, these issues have always been around. I think it's much more, people just hear them more from their friends now, just because everything is so quick to be out in media. And so I think as someone who is in a position like I am, and certainly y'all know this, you have to consistently know what's out there. You have to be attentive to it, and you can't react quickly on everything, because that might not be the right way to handle it. You have to step back and look at the big picture. Where is this in the scheme of things? And use good judgment, because if you do react to everything, then sometimes you're only talking about a small group of people who have had an opinion that happened to get exploded across the media. So I'm not sure it's any different. I think there is just it's in people's minds more, and there's an exchange of information that's more rapid than ever.
I'm wondering if we could turn our attention to the Every Child Achieves Act. This would be the successor to No Child Left Behind, and it passed in the Senate in July and still in the House, I think, in conference committee. Some of the criticism I've seen is that this bill could take away the standards, or at least what's reported about disabled children, about English as children. Right. But there are also some happy points, at least from Senator Alexander's office, that states would have the right to develop their own standards without punitive action from the federal government.
Right.
What would you like to see this act achieve relative to your role in Tennessee, and what are the things that you can live with, and maybe things that should be improved?
Right. Well, first I would say having flexibility at the local level for standards is absolutely the right direction, but you also want to have some comparability among states, and I think that's important for us to know how are our kids performing against somebody from Kentucky. We border so many states. You want to know, how's Tennessee performing? And so you want to keep some level of comparability, and that's why truly the Tennessee Diploma Project standards that were built on America Diploma Project standards and Common Core, the intent behind those was about states really trying to work together and have some comparability and set high expectations as a group. So I think some version of that can still exist, even with a lot of local control, which I believe we've always had. I would be in the camp of we've had local control about our standards. We've made decisions as a state about our standards. We've determined when we reviewed them, when we changed them, when we adopted them. We've always had that. I don't think that's going to change. It may feel like, now we've got something that says, the federal government can't do certain things. I quite frankly think we've already had that kind of flexibility in Tennessee. In terms of your question about the different, what they consider the subgroups, the 4 subgroups that we report on yearly, and that's really to look at equity issues, gap issues, achievement gap issues, Black, Hispanic, Native American, economically disadvantaged, our English learners, and our students with disabilities. So specifically, I would respond to that and say we have to keep attention to those 4 subgroups. Whether the federal government makes us report on it yearly is somewhat irrelevant to me because we're going to be doing that in Tennessee. We have that as part of our strategic plan, and I would note in your packet that I believe Ashley passed out, you'll see this cardstock document, and you'll see all means all here in the middle. This is one of our priority areas. And when you flip in this packet, which is an overview of our strategic plan, and go to all means all, which looks like it's right in the middle. I mean, you're going to see on our strategies, this is about ensuring that all of these subgroups are well taken care of. Mm-hmm. We're going to do that anyways. I mean, this is our strategic plan for the next 4 to 5 years, and we can't lose sight of students who are in these groups. And if you look at the chart right in front of it, I think this graph will be of interest to you. Here are our 4 subgroups, and this is just in 3 through 8 English language arts, because as you know, we have a focus on reading in English language arts because of our data is showing not strength there. If you look at economically disadvantaged, you have 36% of them who are proficient or advanced. The comparison group would be 67% proficient or advanced. These 2 areas, economically disadvantaged and Black, Hispanic, Native America, have improved over the last 2 years. We are actually improving and closing the gaps. We've not had the same results as a state with English learners or students with disabilities. You can see they're very low in comparison to the comparison group. So our work will be, regardless of the reporting structure that we'll have with US Ed, which I'm fine to not do to them, we're going to have to pay attention to it, and we will, because we're monitoring, are we improving with all of our students, not just is your majority group improving or your comparison group improving. So again, I think for us, we will be doing some of the same work anyways, and I feel like we've already had the flexibility with standards. Mm-hmm. Now, you might say, well, you might not get as much money for X, Y, or Z. Again, I think that's irrelevant. We're going to do the same work one way or the other, and we will figure out ways to do that in Tennessee.
One thing I'm curious about, you having been in the classroom and certainly trained teachers, is the issue of parental involvement, because oftentimes that's one thing I've heard, even when I covered education, right. That's really the very tough nut to crack. The question is, when you have urban districts that have 70% of children who live in poverty, mm-hmm. for example, or around that amount, how does the state have a role, or how do you see your role in engaging those parents to ensure these kids are successful? Because they're certainly a key part of whether or not these kids will succeed.
Right. That's a very important question. I mean, I wrote my dissertation on parent beliefs and how you, as a new teacher, should work with parents based on what they believe about education and how they think about their child's future. And so, in that work and early research on some of those topics, you realize how important it is to engage parents very early on. Parents who are from backgrounds where they haven't gone to college, parents who don't speak English as their first language, they're more hesitant to come to school and engage with you because they feel like they're not at the same level that you are educationally, and so there's already a hesitancy. So our work as educators is that we've got to really bend over backwards. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. You're going to have to do more to engage parents than less, particularly with parents who are different than you in terms of background. And so we've got to spend more time in our teacher preparation, our teacher training, really engaging our new teachers in the belief that parents are important. I think we assume that teachers believe parents are important and that they're a partner. But do we know? Do we know that's what they believe? And so in teacher preparation, in my background, it was always about, let's think about your beliefs about parents and about families. And let's break through some of those beliefs that may not be appropriate. Like you might think, well, you're from an economically disadvantaged background, you're from a poverty situation, you don't want your kids to be successful, right? You work all the time and you're not talking to your kids and you don't care about their homework. Well, we were doing things to break through that. That's not at all what they believe, right? Their belief is they want their kids to be as successful as anybody else wants their kids to be successful, but they have barriers to that. What does poverty really mean in terms of barriers? So we worked with Metro School the last several years at Lipscomb to do poverty simulations with new teachers before they got in the field. To say, what does it feel like to truly be in poverty? And then how does that impact what you as a teacher would need to do to engage that family? Those were some of the most powerful conversations. We would have burgeoning teachers crying because they never thought about it. They never thought about how does this impact their relationship and their learning. We have to do more of those type of things in teacher preparation to get people out into the field already with certain belief systems where they engage quickly. Now here's the issue. Our teachers need to be doing more home visits, seeing kids in their own environment, and actually engaging with them in the area that's safe and comfortable to the families, because then they hear you. Like, you've come to my home and you've seen my home. Now I'm hearing what you're saying about what I can do about my kids.
On a practical level, how do you get districts to actually do that? Because look, there's going to be a lot of teachers that are just trying to make it through the day.
Absolutely.
Because maybe they've got a class size that's really too big, for example, or they have a lot of kids in their class that need special attention or whatever the case might be. And then all the grading they have to do and everything after that. So how do you actually go and get districts and teachers to be able to, and what support do they need to actually be able to do it? Because you can talk about it and you can teach it and you can prepare them for it in college, and districts can talk about it on the 30,000 foot level, but
how do you do it?
How do you actually do it given everything else that we ask teachers to do?
Well, I think first you have to believe that it's one of the most important things you do. So the first is the belief, and then your action starts changing. If you believe that this engagement really works, then you start figuring out, how do I plan my time and my day to make this happen? An example, I worked with Cameron Middle School, and it's transitioned to Cameron College Prep for several years. It was the first transition from a public, traditional public school to a public charter school. And we said that's important because we had lots of English language learners. That neighborhood had changed significantly. And so what we did at that school was we changed the PD day. So instead of all your professional development days, you're sitting there in the library listening to somebody speak, and you're half asleep. I'm not big on sit and get PD. Then we would take that day, because kids are at home on professional development days. That's what's lovely about this. And we would get buses, get them donated time, and we would take the teachers and we would go out to these apartment complexes where many of them lived, right there by Purity Dairies down Lafayette. And we would park and we would get out, and we would have, the kids would come out and they were so excited. We would tell them we're coming, tell your parents we're coming. They would come out with their pets and we'd sit there and talk to them, talk to their families. Most of their families did not speak English. So we had translators with us. We would go in their home, they would tell. Then you could sit down with them before you left and say, here's some things we want you to do with your kids. It's translated in Spanish. We had multiple languages that it was translated into. They would listen to you, where before I hadn't seen them in the building ever. And you would see an engagement level that was different the next time you would have a family event. People would come because they know you. You would ask them about, you remember that picture of your family I saw? How's Granddad doing? And then you would realize that there are these compartments that have 15 people living there, right? And so then I'm thinking, when I send homework home and there's 15 people in the house, right? How is that child getting a space to study? When I say house, I'm really talking about an apartment. And so it changed our behavior as well. It wasn't just about their behavior, it was about what do we learn in our behavior. That is a no extra time solution. That's a professional development day. You figured out how to make that happen. I have seen this work beautifully in lots of different states. It's usually local areas, maybe charters who have said this is important to our culture. A lot of traditional schools are doing the same thing. Or you're intentional about, here are my groups in my class, and I've got 2 or 3 kids that are students with disabilities or English language. I need to pay specific attention to them because I need to get to know them. I need to have a relationship to be able to move their performance. So those are the ones I'm going to have a specific home visit to. I'm going to have a different kind of relationship there than you might have with some of the other students in your class where you're more similar to that student's background. I think you have to be more intentional, and you have to believe that it's important to the progress of your students. And so I would say, back to your question about parents, on a state level, what in the world can we do, right? It's like, well, what can you do? You can talk about this, and that can happen at the local level. Well, 1, we can say it's important. 2, we're trying to engage parents in a different way. So last night we had a TNReady teletown hall. It's a beautiful event. I've never done this before, but we did an hour-long, basically radio show on the telephone where we invited parents to learn about TNReady, and we had 10,000 parents at any one time on the call. Peak time was about 1,800 parents, so we did a small sort of, selected region. We're going to do a much larger one of these in January, but it was to say, parents, you want to know about TNReady? I'm on the call. We had our teacher of the year, Kathy Whitehead, on the call, 3rd grade teacher, and we answered questions. And it was a great experience, first time we had done it, but parents engage. They want to hear directly from you. We're trying to do the same thing. We're starting a parent advisory council, first time we've done that as a state. To say parents are important in our messaging, in our partnership, and we want to hear directly from them about what's not working. What suggestions do you have? How do we communicate better? How do we have a better partnership with districts that would help you engage? We feel like that's been an area where we've not done as well. It's hard to figure out how to get directly to parents. And we try to do it through districts, and we still will do that, but we also know that there are ways that we need to engage with them directly for our own policy work, processes, communication, messaging, and those types of things. And TNReady is a huge change, and you want to make sure parents understand the change.
One of the things that you mentioned, the truth in advertising, just kind of a shift of it. One of the things, concerns, and we had an editorial on it, and it wasn't to be the party pooper, but just to basically say, look, I know that the National Report Card Assessment came out.
Yes.
There were a lot of cheerleaders, and we understand that we want to be proud of our children, but we also have to be very realistic of where we are in terms of our results. So where do you see the next, what are your goals for the next few years in terms of where we end up, and how we can basically explain that sometimes it's okay not to say you did good, it's like you need to do better.
Right. First of all, that was fair. I mean, I understand the perspective that you took, and it is fair. I would say that we know from where we've been to where we are now that we're keeping the progress while some states have gone backward. And so that was the message we wanted to send to teachers, is that truth in advertising, we did essentially stay the same, but we had huge progress between 2011 and 2013. We kept those same gains with new groups of students, which again is remarkable because of what that historical gain meant to us back in 2013, while many states were going backwards in these same areas. And so that was the message, but it was also to say we've got work to do. I mean, I've been very clear, all of our data points show a problem in reading. Every data point. NAEP is saying it. TCAP results, I mean, they are consistent. We have issues in reading, and we're not doing some things that we believe we could be doing, that we see other states doing, that are having progress. I look specifically at the states who had reading progress in NAEP. They have been doing layers of work for the past several years that we're not doing. And so our strategies in reading are layered. It's not one thing, we're going to do that and everything's going to change in a year. This is going to take work, and it's going to be multiple years. After I'm gone, I hope we start seeing the progress of this. We believe we will see progress faster than that. But the layers are, we got to do something different to prepare teachers, right? I mean, reading standards got to be changed. We've got to think differently about how we prepare teachers in both the art and science of reading, and how to intervene when you notice any child has a deficiency in reading. We're not doing things soon enough. We don't understand it as well as we should, and so we don't know what to do. right? So you have a child who looks like they're not reading well, but what are the strategies? What's the next steps that you should be taking? Secondly, we have to do more earlier. So an early intervention is built on what do we know about kids when they enter kindergarten. Gaps already exist, by the way, in their language before they ever get to school, right? And so we have a kindergarten screener, a universal kindergarten screener across Tennessee, so a common kindergarten screener. Some districts already have something like this, but we don't have one common across all districts, and then some districts don't have one at all. We believe we've got to have entry-level information when folks enter kindergarten around what should we be doing next. We don't want kindergarten to be a repeat of pre-K either, right? Kindergarten should be where are they when they come in, and let's move them to that next stage of development, because kindergarten is so developmental in nature. You get kids at different levels, and I want to move them forward. So one size fits all kindergarten or first grade or second grade really doesn't work. So we've got to know where they are coming in and then intervene with them early if we already see, oh my goodness, language deficit is significant here, or we already have some issues with the number of words that they know, or there are other issues that are obvious when you use a screening tool. So we've got to do that as a state. Other issues that we see is that we have teachers right now in the field that have varying levels of understanding of how to intervene with a 3rd through 8th grader who might not be reading on grade level. And so we will be doing a statewide literacy coaching initiative that actually connects with the districts. This means that we have a reading course in Tennessee. About 7,500 teachers have taken this reading course. It's a reading course that the state puts on. We do it through our core offices across the state. We have a goal to double that this year, so 15,000 teachers will have had the reading course, but we know that's not all they need. They need coaches, people who are literacy experts, back in the field with them, back in their districts and the classrooms, making sure that they're now implementing these things well with real kids, and that it needs to be intentional over the next several years. That will pay huge dividends, because right now, I think we have low-hanging fruit. People don't know what to do. Teachers have a baseline of what to do, but it's now every child may come with a different deficit. What do you do with all kids? And then implementing RTI, our response to instruction and intervention, will mean when we do identify kids that we're doing things that actually move them to the next step, not teaching an isolated skill, but giving them high quality instruction that's now taken to another level for that child. We have taken our districts and put them in tiers based on their implementation of RTI. Who needs more help? Who's somewhere in the middle? Who's a high flyer that these folks can learn from? And so we're taking those tiers to try to network our districts together better and provide much more technical support to some of our places who we don't feel like are where they need to be. All of those layers, plus supporting what happens between 0 and 4, training our child care center workers in foundations of reading. We're talking about that, doing that across state government agencies to say, if you are caring for children, knowing what good reading instruction looks like, even with that age group, is really important. And the importance of just reading to children, asking them questions, thinking about listening comprehension, talking about words, teaching them words. They need to be doing that at 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old. It's not, let's wait till they get to school. So those are some of the layers of the work that we'll be doing.
Excellent. Well, we're at the end of our time, but are there any final remarks or questions before we conclude? Commissioner, do you have anything?
I just want to say you have a packet in front of you. I hope that you will look through this. It does have strategic plan items, some of the NAEP graphs I know you've seen, and then we do have the TNReady guidebooks that we're using with educators, and then the assessment task force items. And I'd say in closing, we took the results from a report that came out not too long ago, and President Obama endorsed it and talked about changes that we need to think about in terms of assessment. We can say we were already doing that through the assessment task force recommendations, and much of what was recommended we're already moving on. And so it was a really good confirmation of the work that we're already trying to do as a state.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Commissioner. And thank you to our audience here at Tennessean.com, to all our guests and our journalists.